Who invented Monopoly? That sounds like a simple question, right? Well, maybe, but the answer is not so simple. It turns out that the game has a pretty long, interesting, and somewhat controversial history. So let's take a look. In today's video, we are going to talk about a woman named Elizabeth Magie, the woman who invented Monopoly, and Charles Darrow, the man who got all the credit and royalties for the game. I will also try to answer a few more controversial questions like who invented the Monopoly and who invented the first Monopoly. Sounds confusing? Don't worry, I got your back. Watch this video till the end to find the truth. So, let's begin. In 1903, a left-wing feminist called Lizzie Magie patented the board game that we know as Monopoly. But she never gets the credit before. But now she is finally being recognized as the creator of the game that became Monopoly. The Monopolists, Obsession, Fury, and the Scandal Behind the World's Favorite Board Game, a new book by journalist Mary Pallone, has received a lot of media attention recently for shedding light on the game's disputed history. This story, in my opinion, exemplifies how the invention process is frequently more complicated and interesting than the cliche of an individual inventor who has a eureka moment and creates a marketable product. Lizzie Magie, born in Illinois in 1866, moved to the Washington, D.C. area in the 1880s and worked as a stenographer and typist at the dead letter office. Magie had a very unusual life. Unlike most women of her age, she supported herself and did not marry until she was 44 years old. She wrote poetry and short stories and performed comedic routines on stage in addition to working as a stenographer and secretary. She also spent her free time designing a board game that expressed her strong political beliefs. Lizzie Magie was an anti-monopolist, and she hoped that the game would demonstrate that land grabbing and expansion would only benefit a few landowners while leaving rent-paying tenants in poverty. This sparked her idea to create a board game to teach her economic theories to friends and co-workers. Magie patented the original version of her board game while living in Brentwood, Maryland, Landlord's Game. Although Magie's game is the oldest known version of Monopoly, it had two sets of rules. There was an anti-monopolist set in which everyone was rewarded for creating wealth, and a monopolist set in which the goal was to create monopolies and destroy your opponent. She hoped that the game would demonstrate how morally superior the first set of rules were. She'd probably be disappointed to learn that it's the monopolist version that's been so successful. That is a fairly straightforward answer to the question of who first invented Monopoly and why. But I did warn you that it wasn't such a simple question. There was one man who liked the game so much that he made his own version. Charles Darrow has been credited as the creator of Monopoly for much of its history and is still listed in many publications today. While Lizzie Magie is hardly ever mentioned, Darrow introduced the Monopoly board game to Parker Brothers, and his adaptation ended up selling millions of copies. In fact, many versions of the game even included a touching narrative explaining how the creator created it while indignant and went on to make a fortune from it. Although Charles Darrow is an important figure in Monopoly history, it seems unfair that Lizzie Magie's role has been minimized and almost completely erased from history. Who made Monopoly first? Monopoly was created and sold for the first time by Charles Darrow. He handcrafted the first sets with the assistance of his wife and son. In 1935, he struck a deal with Parker Brothers to mass-produce the game, which has since become one of the world's best-selling board games. The Parker Brothers game was an instant success, selling 278,000 copies in its first year of release, and 1.75 million copies the following year, but it was only available in the USA at that time. The first Monopoly games. After seeing a similar game at a friend's house, in the Atlantic City version of Lizzie Magie's The Landlord's Game, Charles Darrow began developing his Monopoly game. He obtained a copy of the rules and game board from his friends and used them as the foundation for his new game. He drew the first versions of Monopoly on oilcloth by hand before contacting a printer who printed his designs on a square board. It is kind of obvious that Charles Darrow was directly copying the other game, because he was able to copy some misspellings such as Marvin Gardens rather than Marvin Gardens from his friend's homemade version of the Landlord's Game. So, who is the real inventor of Monopoly? The Landlord's Game, a creation of Lizzie Magie, should be recognized as the precursor to Monopoly. Despite a number of differences from the well-known version, it should be acknowledged as the first Monopoly game, because it contained many of the game's fundamental concepts and themes. Back history of Magie's original game is important. In 1904, Lizzie Magie obtained a patent for the Landlord's Game. A square game board with 9 rectangular spaces on each side was included in this activity. Each of the buildings could be purchased, and if another player landed there, they would have to pay rent. In the corners were spaces that included go to jail and free public parking. Players would continue around once they passed the start space. This was quite unusual at the time since almost all games followed a linear path. Several homemade versions of the Landlord's game were created over time, including one that used streets in Atlantic City as the properties. Many people referred to the game as Monopoly rather than by its official name. Contribution of Charles Darrow. A few friends took Charles Darrow to see the Landlord's game in Atlantic City. He was inspired by this and started developing his own Monopoly-branded version of the game. Millions of copies of this game, which was later sold by Parker Brothers after being patented, were sold. Although it could be argued that Darrow largely replicated an already existing game, he did create some of the iconic design elements that contributed to the game's success. He introduced iconic elements such as the black trains on the railroad stations, the red arrow on the go space, the car on free parking, and the faucet and light bulb that go with the waterworks and electricity company with the help of graphic artists. Lizzie Magie is rarely credited as the game's inventor or co-inventor, especially in official Parker Brothers releases. How much did the creators of Monopoly make? Charles Darrow became a multi-millionaire after selling the Monopoly game to Parker Brothers. He wisely struck a deal in which he received a portion of the royalties from one of the best-selling games of all time. Lizzie Magie, who came up with the original idea, made almost nothing. When Parker Brothers acquired Monopoly from Charles Darrow, they also acquired Lizzie Magie's patent for the Landlord's game. Given the obvious similarities between the two games, it is most likely that this was done in order to avoid any potential legal issues. Only $500 was paid to Lizzie Magie in exchange for the patent for the Landlord's game. She hoped that after both games were widely released, people would realize her game was better. Parker Brothers actually only produced a very small number of copies of the Landlord's game, just enough to ensure the ownership and patent were secure. It is thought that Magie received absolutely no financial reward for her invention once production costs and legal fees are taken into account. So, now you know who invented Monopoly. The fact that Lizzie Magie was almost completely erased from the game's history while Charles Darrow was able to claim all the glory seems pretty unfair to me. Even though she came up with a large portion of the original Monopoly concept, she essentially died penniless. I suppose credit should go to Charles Darrow for recognizing a well-liked homemade game and adding some excellent artwork and attractive design elements that undoubtedly contributed to its success. But it would have been nice if he or Parker Brothers had acknowledged Lizzie Magie's contribution and given her co-creator status. But perhaps this is appropriate, because it goes against the winner-take-all mentality of Monopoly itself. That's all for today's video. Have you subscribed to the channel? If not, subscribe today so you don't miss out. I hope you like the video, and if you do, hit the like button and share it with your friends and family to let the world know the truth. I will see you in the next video. Till then, stay tuned.